Good to see so many people out this morning. I want to welcome our visitors, our guests, and those joining with us on our Facebook page live stream. Hopefully the mics don't go out again. We're working on that. This morning's lesson is entitled, In the Kingdom. And then in quotes, for such a time as this. And taking our text from Esther 4 and verse 14, I'm actually going to read that very early on. So if you want to be turning over to the book of Esther, Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, and just a disclaimer, Esther's not really going to be the prominent character in this lesson, in this morning's lesson. This morning's lesson, and the prominent character is going to be you and me. I had a request about a month or so ago, 2 months ago, early or middle of summer, to do a lesson on being a servant. And I decided to use the month of September as kind of the springboard of talking about lessons on serving. And so last week, as we concluded the spirit of competition lesson, looking at how we are to have good and friendly, honest competition and not seeking the disaster of one another so that we might get ahead, at the end of that, it ended on the note of being a servant. I want to carry through with that theme this morning of being a servant. And being a servant is being used of God for one another and for Him and for His purposes and glory. As we turn over to the book of Esther, this passage, Esther 4 and verse 14, to me is one of the linchpin passages of the entire book. And that could be argued. There might be another passage that you think is the linchpin passage, but to me this is what set everything in motion that's about to happen. And that is in Esther 4 and verse 14. Mordecai finds out about Haman's evil plan. That genocide of the Israelite people has been taking place behind the scenes, and Mordecai learns of it. And so he tells Esther. And she's wondering what can she do about it. She's the queen. She doesn't really want to lift a finger. And so he says to her, if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether or not you've attained royalty for such a time as this. For such a time as this. Esther didn't want to be queen. She didn't set out seeking to be queen and put in a position of power and glory and honor. This was something that was of happenstance, out of her control, that happened. And she finds herself in this position of power. And then behind the scenes and working behind that story of Esther's rise to prominence, you find out there was a plot against the king, and Mordecai saved the king's life. You find out that Haman hates Mordecai with such a hatred that he doesn't want to just see Mordecai killed. He wants to see all of his people wiped out. And so Haman puts in a plan to wipe out the Jews. And Satan's having a field day because the king signs off on it. No questions asked, no investigation into Haman's words. Just signs off on it, and under Persian law, once it's been signed, it cannot be undone. And so this is as good as done. Haman's excited, his family's excited. Mordecai finds out and tells Esther. In Esther chapter 4, 1-9, we find out about this plot back in Esther chapter 3. Mordecai learns of it in Esther 4, 1-9. He puts on sackcloth and ashes, and he wails and weeps loudly in the streets. It reaches Esther's ears, the queen. This is her uncle. So she sends word to find out why is he behaving this way. And she finds out that Mordecai wants her to talk to the king. So in verses 11 through 14, Esther reminds Mordecai that anyone that goes to the king unsummoned will be put to death unless the king reaches out his golden scepter to accept you. And she goes on to remind Mordecai, her uncle, that despite being queen, that fate befalls her too, and she had not been summoned to the king for 30 days. That's her response to your people are in jeopardy. My life first. I can't go before the king. Mordecai says, who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this. His point is, you're there. You can do something about it. And if you don't act, you will not escape the injustice of the sword. You and your father's house will perish. But deliverance for the Jews will come another place. And though God is not mentioned in this book, his hand is seen throughout it. Mordecai's faith is that God will protect his people, because the promises he has made of a coming Messiah had not yet been fulfilled. And he says God will protect his people. Who knows whether you've not attained royalty for such a time as this? So in chapter 4, 15 to 17, Esther tells Mordecai she would go, and after 3 days of fasting. This isn't a decision she's going to make lightly. She's going to prepare for it. She told Mordecai and his people to fast as well, which often included praying. And she asked him to fast and pray for her for 3 days. A lesson here is for us that when making big decisions, don't leave God out. Don't take it lightly. Don't rush into it. James 4:15 says, before you decide I'm just going to go here and there and conduct business as usual, remember God and put God first. We see an example here where Esther and Mordecai put God first. In Esther 4:15 to 17, they pray and they fast for 3 days. And so in Esther chapter 5, 1 to 4, Esther braves the law and she enters the king's throne room. And she finds favor. He holds out that golden scepter to her. And the king offered anything to her for coming uninvited. What a shock. Who could have prepared for this? Not only does he accept her, but then he says, ask anything you want and I'll give it to you up to half my kingdom. And she invites him and Haman to a banquet. That's all she asks. I just want you and your right-hand man, Haman, to join me for a banquet. And then from there, as we know the rest of the book, her plan goes into motion to save her people. Esther chapter 5, beginning in verse 5, all the way through chapter 10 and verse 3 as we finish up the book. But it all started from the motivation that Mordecai put her on the path by saying, maybe she's there, placed by God for such a time as this. My question this morning is, after looking at Mordecai's words to Esther, that she was there at that time when she was needed. She was there when her people needed her. My question for us is, what if we're in the kingdom of Christ with our unique talents, abilities, experiences, backgrounds for such a time as this? What if we're in the kingdom because God needs us to act, to do something, to step up, help someone, to further his cause? So I have just a few ways that we can look at this, that we might be in the kingdom for such a time as this. What about an encourager like Barnabas? Maybe you are an encourager like Barnabas. In Acts chapter 4, 36 to 37, we get introduced to this man. Now Joseph, a Levite of Cyprian birth, who was also called Barnabas by the apostles, which translated means son of encouragement, and who owned a tract of land, sold it and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet. He was a man from Cyprus named Joseph, and he must have been a man with such a personality. He must have been a joy to be around. He must have been the friend that we all wish we had, the friend that we all want to have. Because he was known by his personality so much so that the apostles named him from Joseph to Barnabas, which means son of encouragement. That encourages me that this man's ability and talent, first and foremost, that he was known for, was for his ability to encourage people, to motivate them, to build them up, and make them perhaps act in their best way possible. He then later on in Acts chapter 9, 26 to 28, takes a strange situation where Saul of Tarsus sees Christ, speaks with him on the road to Damascus, and is told to wait a couple days for Ananias to come, and that he'll tell him what to do. And Ananias comes and teaches him the gospel, and he arises and he's baptized into the gospel. Now Saul of Tarsus is in the kingdom. And he goes to Jerusalem after some time, and the apostles there want nothing to do with him. We know who you are. We know what you're about. Maybe you want to find out where we're meeting. Maybe you want to find out our addresses. Write it in your little black book of death and then hand it over to the authorities so we can be swept up and imprisoned like everyone else. We can imagine their thoughts. We can imagine their fears. Barnabas swoops in this strange situation and takes Saul before the apostles and vouches for him and says, I know what this man has done in Damascus. Not persecution. No, how he taught and defended the faith and the gospel and defended who Jesus was from the scriptures to the Jews in Damascus. And Barnabas takes this strange situation where the disciples were afraid of this man Saul. And we find that the apostles accepted him and Saul moved freely among the brethren there afterwards. What an encourager. What a man to have on your side. Maybe today, that's your ability. Maybe you have just that right word at the right moment to lift somebody up from the bad day that they're having. To lift someone up from the ashes. Tell them that you appreciate them. Tell them they've done a marvelous job at whatever it is that they've done. Whatever it is, maybe you have that ability to build somebody up. Use it. Be that encourager. In Colossians 4:7-8, we can read that Paul talks about a man named Tychicus. He sent him to Colossae to encourage the saints there. This man too must have had the gift and ability to encourage people, for Paul to send him to encourage the brethren at Colossae. Sometimes encouragement is downplayed, but encouragement is important. Lest we grow weary, lest we become discouraged. And it happens to the best of us. It happens to all of us. There's those times that we just don't feel like getting up, taking up that cross and keep moving. If you have that ability to lighten that load and encourage that person, then use it. Encouragement is important. In fact, 1 Thessalonians 5:11 and verse 14, Hebrews 3 and verse 13, Hebrews 10:23-25, all speak about when we come together. One of the purposes is to encourage one another, to stimulate one another to love and good works. We need to be those people. We need to all be that person that motivates and encourages one another. This morning, perhaps you're in the kingdom because you have a gift to build people up. Use it. Don't stay silent. Don't say, what if it doesn't work? Use it. Barnabas did, and the apostles loved him for it and called him the son of encouragement. Maybe you're in the kingdom this morning because you have a heart of a servant like Tabitha and Phoebe. We read of Tabitha in Acts chapter 9, verse 36, all the way through verse 33, but I just want us to focus on verse 36 and 39. In the Greek, her name was Dorcas. But she's also Tabitha and Phoebe in Romans 16, 1-2. But first let's talk about Tabitha. We read in Acts chapter 9, verse 36, Now in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which translated in Greek is called Dorcas. This woman was abounding with deeds of kindness and charity, which she continually did. But she dies. And there's such a scene of beauty that is pictured here. When she dies, they have her laid in this upper room. And they send for Peter to come to Joppa. And this is where he's at when Cornelius sends for him. He's in Joppa. But here he's brought to Joppa because her friends missed her. And they wanted Peter to come do something. We don't know if was it for the purpose of raising her from the dead? Was it to encourage them? I don't know. But whatever it was, when Peter came, what he finds is the widows showed him all that she had made for them, indicating she was a woman who served others. Verse 39, So Peter arose and went with them. When he arrived, they brought him into the upper room, and all the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing all the tunics and garments that Dorcas used to make while she was with them. I don't know about you, but this scene can oftentimes choke me up. Because here's a scene where he walks into a room and this woman is dead, and her friends, the other widows in the town, are standing there, and they're showing Peter, as I just imagine as he walks through this room, they're showing him the things that she made for them. This was the kind of woman she was. She saw to our needs. She made me this blanket. She made me this tunic. She made me this robe. Whatever it is, she made it. I was asked to do the year that we moved here. It was actually one of the last things I did in Alaska. At the end of July of 17, I had been asked by a family back in May. This former member of our congregation got a hold of me, and her sister had died out of state. And they were bringing the body back to Alaska, and it was going to be this process. But anyway, when it arrived, she asked me to do the funeral. It was not someone that I knew. And to my knowledge, I never even knew if I met her sister. But this woman was grieving. She was upset, and I agreed I would do it. And when I showed up to officiate this funeral, it was a very small attendance. It was mostly just family. There might have been one or two friends, but it was mostly just family that were gathered in this room. And I could not help but think of this scene. Because when I arrived, they had a table with a big picture of her. And on this table, they had asked friends, family, and all kinds of other people for this moment to donate things that she had done for them so they could put it on display on this table. And I was looking, and as they were telling me all these different things that were made for so-and-so, and not only in Alaska, but this state and that state, far and wide, her hands had touched these things that she made for all these people. And this table was full of these things that people donated for her remembrance. And I couldn't help but think of what that must have been for Peter to walk into a room and have the widow showing him all that she had done. And I knew immediately, I totally changed what my funeral talk was going to be. On the fly. I didn't know that woman. But looking at that table, I felt I knew someone else from the scriptures that was comparable. And we talked about Acts chapter 9. That's the kind of woman she was. She was a woman who served others. She gave of her time. She sacrificed. And she did it probably gladly, lovingly, willingly. And that's why they missed her. And we know the rest of the story. Going on through verse 43. Peter prays to God, and this woman is raised and given another chance to serve. We read over in Romans 16, 1-2, about a woman named Phoebe. Here's another, again, a woman with a very short passage that we don't know much about what she did. But the words that are used tell us a lot about her. Paul introduces her as a woman who was, quote, a servant of the church, which is at Cenchrea. Cenchrea was a city that was in Isthmus, about 8 miles away from Corinth. So Corinth and Cenchrea would have been called sister cities. Paul said of her that she was, quote, a helper of many and of myself as well. What kind of servant was she? She put others first. She was a servant. What kind of servant? What did she do for the church at Cenchrea? I don't know. The scriptures are silent on that. But Paul commends her to the brethren here at Rome in Romans 16, 1-2. That she was a servant of the church, which is at Cenchrea. She was a helper of many, including Paul. You know, Jesus left for us an example of servitude in John 13, 12-16. He washed his apostles' feet. And it's not the act of washing one's feet that was the example. That was the job of the lowly house servant. Jesus took on that role of the lowly house servant to do that menial task of washing their feet. That was the example. So that we don't say, oh, that's too small a job. That's for other people. I'm not doing that. Jesus said, no, you do it. You have the ability. You have the opportunity. You do it. That's what you do for one another. In Galatians 5:13, it says, from love, we are to serve one another. It is Christ whom we truly serve. That's what Colossians 3:24 says. It's He who is our boss. 1 John 4:15-21. We're supposed to love God and the brethren. And if we don't love our brothers who we see, how can we love God who we've not seen? Philippians 2:3-4. Saints are to regard one another as more important than ourselves. We ought to see the needs of one another and fill them. James 2:15-16, 1 John 3:17-18. So many passages speak about saints having this heart of a servant. Perhaps this morning, you may be in the kingdom with an ability to serve God and serve one another. Maybe you're the one that you see a need and you just jump into action. You don't have a committee. You don't take a poll. You don't ask others. You just see it. You have the opportunity and the means, and you do it. Don't keep quiet. Use it. Be that servant. Use that ability God has given you, because you can do great things in the kingdom with the heart of a servant. Maybe this morning you're in the kingdom with the ability to preach and teach to save the lost, like the Apostle Paul. So many passages here. 2 Corinthians 5, 10 to 11, Ephesians 6, 18 to 20, Colossians 4, 2 through 4. Many of these he's asking for prayers on his behalf, that he might boldly speak the gospel, that he might know how to speak. But what I want to focus in on is Acts 9, 15 to 16. Because at the very beginning, as Saul of Tarsus, and Jesus is sending Ananias to go speak to him, this is what Jesus said the apostle, or Saul of Tarsus, later the apostle Paul, will do. Ananias says, Lord, we know who this guy is, and you want me to go to his house? But the Lord said to him, go, for he's a chosen instrument of mine to bear my name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for my name's sake. Ananias obeyed God. He went to tell Saul of Tarsus what Jesus said. He was a chosen instrument to bear Christ's name before the Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel. And the Apostle Paul fulfilled that. He took the gospel to the Jews. He took it to the Gentiles. Acts 13, he told the Gentiles he's now turning from the Jews to the Gentiles, since the Jews judged themselves unworthy of salvation. And when he turned his attention to the Gentiles, they rejoiced, and they came back to hear him the following week. And he took this message all the way to Caesar. Philippians 4:22 has one of my favorite passages about how far and wide the gospel can go. There were saints in Caesar's household. He said, the saints in Caesar's household greet you. Caesar was not known for his morality, his tolerance, his patience with others, no matter what Caesar you're talking about. And here Paul says there were saints in Caesar's household. There were saints living in that hostile situation because the gospel had taken hold and effect of their hearts. Paul had a way to teach and to save the lost. You know, some people just have that ability to study one-on-one more than others. They have an ability, they're able to connect with who they're talking to. Matthew 4:19, Jesus said he called his apostles to be fishers of men. Luke 19:10, that was Jesus' mission. He says, I've come to seek and save the lost. There are some people that seem to have the ability to fish in any stream more than others. And I'm talking about men. I'm talking about souls. There seem to be those that have that ability to fish more than others. 2 Timothy 2:24 to 26 tells us as bondservants of the Lord. This passage is not speaking about elders or deacons or preachers. It's talking about the bondservants of the Lord. Brethren, that's you and me. That's both men and women. That's all of us. It says we are to be able. The word there is apt to teach. That means skilled at teaching. Our goal in teaching, our mission in teaching is found there in verses 25 and 26. It is to save men from the snare of the devil. And if we're not doing that, we've missed the point. Perhaps you're in the kingdom because you have that ability to teach. You have that ability to reach the lost. Use it. Don't become silent. Use that talent. Use that ability. Perhaps you're in the kingdom this morning as a preacher and teacher to defend the faith. Maybe you're not as good on one-on-one studies. But boy, put you in an environment where you can debate. Put you in an environment where the faith is under fire and you come to the rescue. If you have that ability, use it. There is need in the kingdom for men that will stand up and defend the faith. There is need in the kingdom for women to stand up in their communities and in their circle of friends to defend the faith. Perhaps you're a preacher or a teacher to defend the faith like Timothy. And 2 Timothy 4, it really happens in 1 Timothy 4, 1 to 6, and 2 Timothy 4, 1 to 5, but we just want to read 2 Timothy 4, 3 through 4. Paul says, for the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but wanting to have their ears tickled, they will accumulate for themselves teachers in accordance to their own desires, and will turn away their ears from the truth, and will turn aside to myths. Paul says these are the people you have to engage. These are the people you're going to have to defend the faith from. People from the inside. This is not an outside threat. He's talking about men and women from the inside are going to no longer want to hear what's sound. They're going to want to hear what they want to hear. That's their ears being tickled. And you're going to have to stand up to that. You're going to have to defend the faith. That's what Paul is saying in 1 Timothy 4, 1-6 and 2 Timothy 4, 1-5. And knowing that Timothy was at Ephesus, it makes me wonder what kind of battles were happening at the church in Ephesus. That Timothy was warned in both letters to stand up for the faith, be that soldier of Christ, and defend it. Some people have that ability to defend the truth. Jude 3 says we are to contend earnestly for the faith, once for all handed down to the saints. Maybe you're great at debates. Maybe you're great when it comes to an impromptu argument. Maybe you're great at studying one-on-one with someone to show them the error of their teaching or their belief and get them to see that there is only one faith, that there is one body, there is one church, there is one God, there is one baptism. Ephesians 4, 1-4. This may happen while teaching to save the lost. These two things are not mutually exclusive. But some people really have the ability to defend the truth against error. I've heard men far more skilled than I am at defending the faith. And I'm glad that there's men out there willing to use that ability. I have heard women through their written word. I've read emails of women that have sent emails to other people strongly defending the faith. It is the job of the bondservant of Christ to defend the faith and to save the lost. Ephesians 4, 14-16, we're going to read this later on. And 2 Timothy 2:15, saints are to be studied enough to tell truth from error. He says, rightly dividing the word of God. That's how we be a workman who doesn't need to be ashamed. Perhaps you're in the kingdom this morning with the ability to defend the faith. Don't remain silent. Use it. Perhaps you're in the kingdom this morning able to use your talents and abilities as members of the body. Maybe you're saying, I'm not a preacher, I'm not a teacher. I guess I don't have an ability. Maybe I don't know if I'm an encourager. Maybe I don't know if I know how to serve the needs of others. There are a host of other things that we can all do for one another when we come together. As members of the body, we all have functions to fill. 1 Corinthians 12, 14 and verse 27. 1 Corinthians 12 and, ironically, Romans chapter 12 as well, or coincidentally, if you like that word better, they both speak about the body, the metaphor of the body, that the church is the body. And that as the body, we all have many members, but they all have different things that they do. So it says, for the body is not one member, but many. Verse 27 of 1 Corinthians 12, now you are Christ's body, and individually members of it. The body of Christ is made up of individual members with different functions, and we're told we need to grow together. Read with me Ephesians chapter 4, starting in verse 14. I've referenced it before. I want to read it now. We're going to reference it again at the end. In Ephesians 4, it says in verse 14, in verse 13 talks about, and verse 12 and 13 talks about the equipping of the saints was given to us as a gift from God, that we might attain unity, that we might become mature. And then it speaks in verse 14 about that maturity. It says, as a result, we're no longer to be children, tossed here and there by waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by the trickery of men, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we're to grow up in all aspects into Him who is the head, even Christ, from whom the whole body, being fitted and held together by what every joint supplies, according to the proper working of each individual part, causes the growth of the body for the building up of itself in love. Brethren, what he's saying is when we come together, if we all use the abilities and the talents that we're given, as every joint supplies, then we can grow up together in love to Christ who is the head. We're to do it in love. 1 Peter 4:10 also speaks to this. But for the body to function properly, every member must act accordingly to its role or ability. For example, in our daily lives to those around us, this is what Jesus says in Matthew 5:16, we're to let our light shine before men in such a way they see what we're doing and they glorify our Father. Ephesians 5:11, that light is to expose the darkness. Just our daily lives to those around us can demonstrate our abilities to teach and to serve. When we assemble together, 1 Corinthians 14:40 says, all things are to be done orderly and properly and in order, decently and in order. Just to give you a couple examples of what that looks like, all of us walked in the building this morning. The building maintained for the purpose of meeting together. The Lord's Supper prepared. The song leader ready and prepared. And it's a little harder than where we came from when the song leader might not be there and you show up and someone says, hey, the song leader's not here, can you sing songs? And you're frantically scrambling through the songbook to throw some numbers on the board or say, I didn't have time to put numbers on the board, but everyone turn here. It's a little different here with the paperless hymnal. It calls on our song leaders to be a little more prepared, to put thought into what they're preparing, because they've got to send their numbers either to me or whoever it is that's putting the program together. And so think of the time that went into that. The song leader gave time to put into that. The song leader needs to be ready and prepared. Teachers and the preacher need to be ready and prepared for their classes and the sermon. Not just physically with materials, but mentally prepared for whatever the age group is that they're tackling or teaching. I don't want to give anyone the thought that they're wrangling kids and teenagers, but the teachers need to be prepared to be ready. That meant that before they walked through the building this morning, on Sunday morning, they gave thought and preparation during the week to what was going to be said today. Members need to be ready to participate and serve as needed. As I pointed out in the example of in Alaska, oftentimes the song leader, for whatever reason, wasn't able to make it and someone had to step in. Same thing happens with the prayers. Same thing happens with the Lord's Supper table. All the men, whether your name's on that roster or not, you need to walk through those doors with a mindset to serve in any way and capacity that might be needed of you. You might be called on to do a prayer. You might be called on to assist at the Lord's table last minute. Are you ready? Are you willing to step into those roles? And if you've done it before, if you have that ability, then don't say, no, I pass. Accept it. Do it. Step into that role. Do what is needed. 1 Corinthians 15:58 says to have fellowship in work, all must work. That our work is not in vain. We need to always abound in the work of the Lord. You may be in the kingdom because you fill a role and ability of the body. Use it. Last week we talked about the ballpoint pen analogy. That if you look at just a simple ballpoint pen, the one with the clicker, there's all kinds of internal parts that you don't see on the outside. And they're all necessary to make that thing work. And we talked about how frustrating it is when you go to click and it doesn't click, or it clicks and then it won't retract, or the ink is run out and you can't unscrew it to replace it. What do you do with it? You junk it. We all have a role to play. Maybe you're the silver tip, maybe you're the spring. Be the best silver tip, be the best spring that you can be. We all have a role to play, and you need to use it. Taking our minds back where we began, to the book of Esther. Just as Esther was queen for such a time as this, you may be in the kingdom of Christ for such a time as this. And like Esther, you need to fulfill your role and ability as God has given it to you. When all the members of the body work together as every joint supplies, as we just read there in Ephesians 4 and verse 16, saints are edified. Saints are ready for the work that God has given them to do. Let us work for the Lord and His kingdom. And let us work in His kingdom supposing we are here at this time, at this moment, for such a time as this. And this morning, if you're not a Christian, maybe you are here for such a time as this to hear the gospel message, to hear that Christ died for you, that Christ needs you and your abilities in His kingdom. And you can repent, you can be baptized, and join His family today, this very hour. And if you are a Christian, not living the way that you should, perhaps being that spring that won't retract, being that silver tip that just constantly falls off and causes consternation. Whatever the issue is, if you have not been serving or using the ability God has given you to your fullest, now's the time to recognize that. Now's the time to make it right and repent. And if you are subject to the invitation of the gospel this morning, whether the waters of baptism are ready for you, or the prayers of the righteous to be said on your behalf, you have but need to come forward and let your request be made known. While together we stand and sing.